We mostly watch television to relax and enjoy some lighthearted entertainment. But over the decades, TV audiences have witnessed some dark and disturbing broadcasts that are still spoken about today. Whether they involved natural disasters, high-speed pursuits that ended badly, or daring rescues, these events are usually unforeseen and often leave those who watch these broadcasts in disbelief. Number 10. The Hillsborough Disaster, which occurred in August of 1989 in Sheffield, England, is one that still weighs heavily on the minds of fans of the sport. It's a disaster that could easily have been prevented had the correct procedures been followed, but sadly that wasn't the case. On the 15th of April that year, the Liverpool and Nottingham Forest teams were set to battle each other in the FA Cup semi-finals, and as is to be expected, the Hillsborough football stadium was sold out and packed full of fans who were ready to cheer on their respective teams. Before the match started, it was expected that as many as 53,000 fans would attend, and that there would be tension between the team's supporters. Hence, it was decided that the opposing supporters would enter the stadium from different ends of the field to avoid hooliganism. Liverpool fans entered through two terminals, one larger and one smaller, and were then directed into pens that were enclosed by high fences. But before long, more than 10,000 fans tried to get into the pens, resulting in a bottleneck forming on the Leppings Lane side. Half an hour before kickoff, many fans were still waiting to get in, and the Yorkshire Police Chief Superintendent, David Duckenfield, decided that an additional gate should be opened to allow the flow of fans to enter quicker and more freely. 2,000 fans entered through the gate, but erroneously headed through the larger tunnel to the pens that were already packed with fans, rather than the side pens that only held a few fans at this point. Realizing that the match would start soon, the 2,000 extra fans rushed into the main pens, and a crush started to form. Police officers didn't realize what was happening and believed that the commotion was coming from unruly supporters when they were actually calling for people to back away and pleading for help. The match kicked off, but just in 5 minutes, it became apparent that something was very wrong on the Liverpool supporters' side, and the referee ordered that the match be halted. Officers and supporters did their best to get supporters to re-enter the tunnel, but poor communication hampered their efforts, and the crush continued with some fans climbing over the fences onto the field. TV cameras caught every moment of the disaster, showing supporters being carried on makeshift stretchers that were fashioned from advertising boards, but also showing the fans who were still caught in the crush and desperately trying to get out. When all was said and done, 97 people had lost their lives, and as soon as the dust settled, the police blamed Liverpool fans for the tragedy, stating that they were intoxicated and unruly. Duckenfield stated that some fans forced open an additional gate, but a report on the incident showed that the officers were at fault for allowing the additional 2,000 fans to enter the main tunnel. An additional investigation was launched in 2009, and it was then discovered that police officers had falsified their reports and blamed the tragedy on supporters to hide the fact that they had failed in their duties to protect those in attendance. It was determined that at least 41 people could have been saved had the correct procedure been followed, and in 2014, Duckenfield finally admitted that no one had opened the additional gate and that he had intentionally made a false statement to that effect. He was charged with 95 counts of manslaughter, but found not guilty. Graham Mackerel, the stadium's safety officer, was the only person convicted, and he received a fine in 2019, since he hadn't provided enough turnstiles. Number 9. Most of us are familiar with the Balloon Boy hoax that took place in October of 2009, when a family claimed that their 6-year-old son, Falcon, had become trapped in a large helium-filled balloon, after which he was swept away as high as 7,000 feet. But it was later found that the story was a fabrication. Another similar case took place in April of 2008, but this time it was no hoax, and it would not have a happy ending. That year, a 41-year-old Brazilian priest called Adelir Antonio de Carli decided that he wanted to attempt to break the world record for flying while attached to a balloon cluster. At the time, the record stood at 19 hours, and Carli had already made one attempt during which he lasted 4 hours and soared more than 17,000 feet into the air. On that occasion, he'd used 600 balloons, but for his record attempt, he planned on using as many as 1,000. He made solid preparations for the flight, packing water, food, his phone, a GPS device, and a two-way radio, and a parachute in case of an emergency. On the 20th of April of that year, he tied the balloons to a chair, took his position, and floated into the air in an effort to raise as much money as possible for his parish's work with truck drivers. However, despite all the preparations that had been made, there was one major oversight: the fact that Carly had no idea how to operate the GPS. And 20 minutes into his flight, he radioed down to ask air traffic controllers for instructions. He'd grown increasingly worried that the Brazilian Navy would not be able to track him, but he failed to learn how to use the device beforehand. Before long, he started to drift off of his intended route, and not knowing how to use his GPS, he had no way of informing anyone where he was. He'd reported to the Navy that by this time he'd started to lose altitude, but they were no longer aware of his position, and he had no way of providing it. 8 hours into the attempt, Carly went missing and was no longer communicating with air traffic controllers. Rescue teams were formed to search for the priest, and helicopters as well as airplanes were used to scour far and wide for any sign of him, but without success. 2 days later, it was reported that someone had seen several colored balloons in the ocean off Santa Catarina, but rescue personnel were still unable to locate him. The search was eventually called off without any clues as to Carly's whereabouts being found. It was impossible to guess his position, since he would almost certainly have been swept in different directions by wind currents, and people started to fear the worst. It wouldn't be until a few months later, in July, that Carly's remains were found in the ocean off the southern coast of the country, and after DNA tests were completed, they were confirmed to be his. The record attempt was broadcast live on the Globo TV channel, and many viewers were left in shock after learning of the priest's disappearance mid-flight. His family expressed relief when his remains were found, as they finally had some sense of closure. But most people felt that the tragedy could have been avoided had Carly been properly prepared. Number 8. Niagara Falls attracts hundreds of thousands of tourists each year, thanks to its beauty and the unstoppable force of the water that continuously barrels over the cliff. The highest of which is Horseshoe Falls, which is about 187 feet high and 2,900 feet wide. Needless to say, it's not only very beautiful, but very dangerous. Anyone who's unfortunate to end up in the water and who's swept away by the river's strong currents stands very little chance to escape before going over the falls, which will almost certainly claim their lives. But in 2003, a 59-year-old man whose name has not been made public ended up on the edge of Horseshoe Falls, and the subsequent rescue effort to save his life was caught on camera by a news station cameraman. On that day, visitors to the falls suddenly became aware that a man was standing on the very edge of Horseshoe Falls, and they quickly informed the authorities that someone was in trouble. The water was extremely cold, and onlookers feared that the man couldn't fight against the current for very long. He would later state that he managed to wedge his foot onto a crevice, thereby managing to stay where he was, but he knew time was running out quickly. Niagara Falls firefighters and other rescue personnel raced to the scene, and they quickly realized that the situation was far worse than they had imagined, since the wind was also gusting at high speed. Nevertheless, a rescue helicopter was sent up to try and hoist the man up, but in those few moments, his foot slipped from the crevice where he had wedged it, and he was swept further towards the precipice by the rushing water. Miraculously, he managed to grab that same crevice with one of his hands, and he was left with his legs dangling over the edge of the falls. Moments later, one of the rescue team managed to drop a flotation device near him, and the man managed to grab hold of it. It seemed as though he would finally be lifted out of the water, but then he ended up beneath an ice shelf that had formed on the riverbank, and considering that he'd been in the icy water for 2 hours by this point, he had very little strength left. The decision was then made to not hoist the man into the helicopter, and one brave rescuer jumped into the water, made his way over to the man, and somehow managed to fasten a rescue harness around his waist. He told the man to keep kicking against the current with his legs, and after what seemed like an eternity, rescuers on the bank managed to pull him out of the water to safety. Rescuers would later state that they were astonished at the fact that he survived. It would later be revealed that the man had become depressed when he lost a large amount of money at the Seneca Nation Casino earlier that day, adding to a $600,000 debt that he had racked up at the Casino Niagara in the days prior. He later apologized to his rescuers for putting their lives in danger and repeatedly thanked them for not giving up when his rescue seemed impossible. Number 7. In 1986, Donald Herbert, known to his friends as Don, became a member of the Buffalo Fire Department, where he served as a member of the Heavy Rescue Company, a role that most people would shy away from, but that Don relished in. But on the 29th of December, 1995, he would be involved in an accident that would change his life and that of his family forever. Don and the rest of his crew were called out to 21 Inter Park Avenue, where a house was reportedly going up in flames. They were quick to respond as always, and as soon as they arrived, they scrambled to try and get the inferno under control. A news crew had also gotten wind of the unfolding situation and captured what happened next on camera. Don was fighting the fire from above. It was situated in the building's attic, unaware that the fire had weakened the structure and that he was in a very precarious situation. A few moments later, the roof gave in and came down on top of him. His fellow firefighters did all they could to get to him as quickly as possible, but Don would spend more than 5 minutes under the burning structure in an area that was quickly filling with smoke. All in all, it's estimated that he had no oxygen to breathe for about 6 minutes, and when he was finally pulled from the burning building, there were fears that he wouldn't pull through since his brain has been starved of oxygen for so long. As a result, he suffered cardiac arrest and was rushed to a local hospital as quickly as possible. He survived but fell into a deep coma, leaving his family wondering whether he would ever wake up. A year later, he opened his eyes again for the first time, but was virtually blind. He struggled to speak and had little awareness of what was happening around him. He couldn't walk and had to have assistance eating. When asked about the incident, he stated that he couldn't remember what happened and that he struggled to recognize any of his family members and friends. For the next 9 years, Don remained minimally conscious. On the 30th of April, 2005, his doctor decided to treat him with medication usually reserved for Parkinson's disease, ADHD, or depressed patients. Against everyone's expectations, he became completely lucid. He immediately asked where his wife was, and for the next 14 hours, he spoke almost non-stop to his 4 sons, wife, and the firefighters that he had survived with. He remained in this state for the next few weeks, throwing footballs with his sons from his wheelchair and catching up on the years that he had spent in a coma. Unfortunately, his lucidity would only last a short time, and after a few weeks, he fell back into a semi-conscious state. He then contracted pneumonia that caused him to suffer a 105-degree fever. Due to this and the remnants of his injuries he had suffered while fighting the fire, he passed away on the 21st of February, 2006. He's since been inducted into the National Fallen Firefighters Memorial, which is situated in Emmitsburg, Maryland. 2 of his sons followed in his footsteps and became firefighters, while the other 2 became police officers. A book entitled The Day Donnie Herbert Woke Up has been published about the incident and the years that Don spent in the hospital fighting for his life. Number 6. In June of 1991, 46-year-old Harry Collinson was working for the Derwentshire District Council in County Durham, England, as Chief Planning Officer when he became embroiled in a bitter dispute with a man called Albert Dryden. Dryden had started building structures on his property without first obtaining the proper permits, and it was Collinson's job to make sure these structures were either torn down or that Dryden sought the permits he needed. But Dryden had no plans to comply. Looking into his background, Dryden was one of 8 children and was described by those who knew him as a solitary person who had a very active imagination. At school, he was found to be well below average in terms of intelligence, and at a very young age, he started showing an interest in firearms. He would buy his first when he was just 11 years old, and that same unlicensed weapon would be used many years later in a shocking incident that was caught on camera by a news crew. Since the weapon was an old World War I firearm, he struggled to find ammunition for it, and eventually started making his own. His family's house was raided by the police when he was 17, after they got wind that he was in possession of more than one illegal firearm, and it was quickly determined that he had an unhealthy obsession with these weapons. He would get into trouble again in the 1960s when the police received reports that he was firing rockets, and again after he'd made threats against fellow farmers in the area. At the time, he stated that he was considering moving to Argentina so that he could pursue his dangerous pastimes without interference. He was made redundant from his job in 1982, after which he rented a plot of land in Bushfield. but his behavior only got more bizarre after he bought the property. He started building a house that was set inside a giant hole that he had dug, and in 1989, complaints started flooding into the Derwentside Council from people in the surrounding area. When confronted about the house, he stated that he was building it for his aging mother, but this was found to be a lie. He then changed his story, stating that it was a nuclear fallout shelter. But when this didn't work, he decided that it was actually a cowshed. A public inquiry followed, and when Dryden's mother passed away, it had a profound impact on him. He blamed the council for her passing and made several threats against its staff members, one of which was Collinson. The decision was made to demolish the unsafe structure, but Dryden had no plans to comply. A demolition team arrived on the property along with the news crew, but before anything was done, Dryden confronted Collinson, stating, "You might not be around to see the outcome of this disaster. You've been warned. If you had any sense, you would go away and wait 5 weeks. You're making a sad decision." Collinson had no choice but to go ahead with the demolition, and at one point could be heard telling the cameraman to get a shot of the weapon that Dryden had in his hand. The camera panned to show Dryden and the weapon, but then he did the unthinkable. He leveled the firearm at Collinson and pulled the trigger, hitting him in the chest. Everyone in attendance scrambled to get to safety, but Dryden just kept firing. More police officers arrived by this point, and Dryden fled into a caravan that was parked on the lot. Officers tried to get him to come out, but he warned them that he'd set booby traps in all the buildings. Later, he emerged and walked over to a fence to watch officers install a field telephone, but he'd seemingly forgotten to bring his firearm with him, giving the police the chance to tackle him to the ground and take him into custody. He was found guilty of all charges against him and sentenced to 2 life sentences behind bars. Number 5. While television may be a near endless source of entertainment, some shows are truly ill-conceived and rely on nothing more than sensationalism to draw in viewers, one of which was a show called The Moment of Truth. The show had become popular in other countries in the world, and in 2012 it was aired for the first time in Peru's capital of Lima. The premise of the show was that a contestant would take a seat on a stage in front of a studio audience, which usually contained their partners or family members, and they would then be asked a series of 21 personal questions, each harder and more embarrassing than the last. They would be hooked up to a polygraph machine beforehand, and in full view of everyone in attendance, it would be revealed whether their answers were truthful or not. The more truthful they were, the further they progressed, and the more money they would win. Something that a woman called Ruth Sanchez saw as an opportunity, since the money was hard to come by. She was the very first contestant on this version of the show, and in the audience that night, the 7th of July 2012, were her parents, who were under the impression that she worked at a call center. The first question that Ruth had to answer was, "Do you think your parents would be proud of you if they know what you did for a living?" And it immediately became clear that she felt uncomfortable answering. But she decided to tell the truth so that she could progress further, and revealed that she worked as a hostess at a nightclub, and that she also on occasion received money for intimate services. As the show progressed, the questions became harder and more personal, but Ruth was determined to tell the truth no matter what, since the cash prize was more than the average person in Peru earned in a year. She admitted that she was only dating the man she was with, Russell Romero, until she could find someone better. And after the harrowing episode came to an end, she walked away with a total of about $25,000. It may have seemed worthwhile at the time, since it was a huge sum of money, but Ruth would end up paying the ultimate price for her brutal honesty. 8 weeks after the show had aired, she was found deceased in a well in the city's outskirts. An autopsy revealed that she had some type of poison in her system, and that she'd been murdered through strangulation. Her boyfriend, Romero, immediately became a suspect, and he would later confess that he'd used sleeping medication to render her immobile before ending her life with the help of a family member. It was suspected that Romero was embarrassed by Ruth's revelations, and that he felt entitled to some of the money that she had won, though this was never proven. Number 4. Between 1994 and 2001, TV audiences in Brazil became familiar with a children's show called Susa Park, known by fans as simply Xuxa, the name of the presenter who was also a model, actress, and singer. It was based on another show that aired in Spain during the 90s and featured singing, cartoons, and several different games. The set was always decorated with colorful props and rides, such as a spaceship from which Xuxa would appear at the beginning of each episode. The show was an instant success among its younger viewers, but in 2001, it would be brought to a grinding halt thanks to a terrifying incident that took place during filming in front of a live audience. On the 11th of January that year, the show was drawing to a close, and Susa was in the middle of a musical number along with several other dancers. Unbeknownst to them, a component inside the spaceship had short-circuited and a small fire had started. A stagehand saw what was happening and quickly grabbed a fire extinguisher, but he was unable to douse the flames that had suddenly erupted in an uncontrollable inferno in full view of the audience. The spaceship was now fully engulfed in flames, and Susa ran for cover, as did everyone else who was close to the stage. In a matter of seconds, the fire spread to the rest of the set, and people started running for the exits in a blind panic. The camera crew had also fled, but their cameras were still rolling and captured the ensuing chaos as the stage was reduced to near cinders. It took less than a minute for the fire to spread across the entire set, as wood burned, plastic melted, and smoke billowed into the air. Quite unbelievably, no one perished in the fire. 4 people had to be treated for injuries, and several others had suffered smoke inhalation, but they all went on to make full recoveries. The show's clown and Susa's bodyguard, a man named Leo Nilsson, were hailed as heroes since they sustained injuries while rescuing people from the fire. The incident had a serious effect on Susa, who's said to have suffered from severe depression in the months after. She was unable to perform for some time and visited many of the families that were present on the day of the fire. She eventually returned to the spotlight, but the show was canceled and never aired again. In a strange and twisted attempt to sensationalize the incident, some religious people started claiming that the fire was no accident and that Susa herself was to blame. They claimed that she was hiding messages in some of her songs in the past, and that she was involved in Satanism, and that she had called forth the fire, since the song she was performing was actually some kind of ritual. They also claimed that she was laughing as she fled from the stage, but footage from the incident clearly showed this was not the case, since she was also terrified, and all suggestions that it had been set deliberately were quickly dismissed. Number 3. Bill Sherk was born in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1945, and later on attended Ball State University in Muncie, from where he obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in education. In 1968, he became the station manager for Work Radio, but his duties stretched much further than this. He also served as the station's sales manager, program director, production manager, and DJ positions that he would hold for 4 years until 1972. He then took a job as a general manager at WXLW, a station in Indianapolis, which he eventually bought 2 years later. He also bought a TV station, but would remain a familiar voice on the radio into the 2000s. But this wasn't his only interest, as he also started performing as an escape artist, following the footsteps of the famous Harry Houdini. He started performing in 1976, setting as many as 8 world records between then and 1980. He became the fastest person ever to escape from a straitjacket, which he did in less than 5 seconds, and also escaped from a jail cell faster than anyone had before. In 1977, he performed to raise money for a Marion County charity, and after being buried with a python, 2 tarantulas, and a rattlesnake for 79 hours, he received a personal donation from then-President Jimmy Carter, and in total raised $10,000. He also appeared in a movie called The Escapist, in which he plays a radio station owner who has to fight against a large corporation that intends to take over the station. While these events in the film were fictional, he did perform several escapes for the role, including escaping from a straitjacket while hanging from a helicopter that hovered 1,600 feet above the ground. Throughout his career, one of his most famous escapes involved him being buried alive, a stunt that he successfully completed 10 times, and before long he was hailed as the foremost escape artist in all of America. He'd avoided being run over by a train, diving between the tracks just before it hit him. He'd run with the bulls in Pamplona while restrained in a straitjacket, and performed many other harrowing stunts, none of which he enjoyed by his own admission. In fact, he stated that if he was given the chance to do it all over again, he would certainly decline. He admitted that he performed his act only to draw audiences to his radio and TV stations. In an effort to push the envelope even further, Sherk decided in 1992 to perform his most daring live burial escape in front of TV cameras. he announced that he'd be buried in a plexiglass coffin, which would then be covered with as much as 14,000 pounds of concrete and dirt. He would then attempt to dig his way out, which would not be an easy feat. In footage from the event, Sherk can be seen as he's placed in handcuffs and placed in the coffin. He's then lowered below the ground by helpers and the coffin is covered with dirt. The footage then cuts to the concrete being poured over the dirt, but that's when things go very wrong very quickly. Suddenly, the plexiglass coffin gives way under the weight of the dirt and concrete, with Sherk still buried below. A backhoe was used to enlarge the hole so that the concrete could flow away, and eventually 2 men were able to extract Sherk after digging down with shovels. Sherk was hospitalized but eventually made a full recovery, against the expectations of everyone who'd witnessed the failed escape attempt. Number 2. Spending the day at a ballpark watching your favorite team is supposed to be a fun and exhilarating experience. But for firefighter and Texas Rangers fan Shannon Stone, one such trip was one that ended in tragedy. On the 7th of July, 2011, 39-year-old Shannon and his son Cooper traveled to Arlington, Texas to watch the Rangers play a game against the Oakland Athletics. His wife, Susan, later revealed that Cooper was excited for the game since he was hoping to catch a foul ball as a souvenir. While driving to the stadium, the pair stopped off at a store to buy Cooper a new glove, and when they arrived, they took their seats behind the left field wall. Shannon was dressed in a blue Rangers cap and white shirt, ready to support his team. In the middle of the second inning, Connor Jackson was up to bat and ended up fouling a pitch past left field, where it ricocheted off the wall and rolled onto the field where the Rangers' left fielder, Josh Hamilton, was fielding. Hamilton retrieved the ball, and Shannon saw his opportunity. He called out to Hamilton, asking him to toss the ball to him so that he could give it to Cooper. Hamilton heard him and tossed the ball towards him, but left it a bit short, and Shannon had to reach over the railing in an attempt to catch it. Unfortunately, he lost his footing and slid over the railing, falling 20 feet head first onto the concrete below. TV cameras caught the moment that he slipped and fell, but thankfully the area where he hit the ground was out of view, since it was located behind the stadium scoreboard. The footage showed a fellow spectator, Ronnie Hargis, who was seated next to Shannon, reach out in an attempt to pull him back, but he was unable to and watched helplessly as the firefighter fell. Miraculously, he was conscious when medical personnel arrived, and he immediately informed him that Cooper was still up in the stands. At first, it seemed as though he'd sustained only minor injuries, and he was carried away on a stretcher, with stadium staff assuring him that they would get Cooper to make sure that he was all right. Shannon was then transported to a nearby hospital, but on the way there he went into cardiac arrest, and all efforts by paramedics to resuscitate him were unsuccessful. He was declared deceased upon his arrival at the hospital. Hamilton, who threw the ball, was devastated when he heard the news of Shannon's passing, and the entire team had a tough time coming to terms with what had happened. Many fans expressed their concerns over the incident, suggesting that the railings should be made higher and that Susan should sue the ball club. Instead, she sent letters to Hamilton and the rest of the Rangers team, stating that Shannon's passing was in no way their fault, and she encouraged them to keep throwing balls to fans, since it was a way for fans to make memories while watching their team play. A bronze statue of Shannon and Cooper was erected by the Rangers in his memory, and also established a memorial fund in his honor. The family received hundreds of supportive letters from all over the country, and Cooper was invited to throw out the first pitch at the Rangers' playoff game against the Tampa Bay Rays, with Hamilton catching the pitch, followed by a big hug. Number 1. Culinary enthusiasts will be very familiar with the famous cooking show MasterChef, which originally aired in the UK on the 2nd of July, 1990. The show has a massive following of viewers that tune in to watch amateur chefs pitch themselves against each other in hopes of winning the title and a cash prize. The show proved to be so popular that it was soon aired in other countries, and before long international versions were released in the US, Australia, and South Africa. Many of the chefs who've appeared on the show have gone on to establish successful careers in the industry, and today it remains as popular as ever. The show has seen its fair share of controversy over the years, but in the 9th season of the original UK version, which aired in 2018, a man appeared on the show who, by all appearances, seemed to be just another assistant chef, but it would later come to light that he had a very dark past that he'd kept hidden since 2014. Stephen Port, the man in question, grew up in East London, and as a child was described as a loner who was often bullied by other children. He left school at 16 years old, and when his parents couldn't afford to pay for art college, he decided to train as a chef. He lived with his parents into his 30s, and when he finally moved out, he lived alone in an apartment in Barking. He landed a chef's position at a stagecoach bus depot in West Ham, and his career seemed to be on track. But he struggled with self-confidence since he was introverted and started to go bald. He wore a toupee to hide his hair loss, and when he made a background appearance on MasterChef, he could be seen wearing it. It was later revealed that he wore the toupee in an effort to boost his self-confidence when he went out to nightclubs to meet other men. He enjoyed going to the gym and at the time was in good physical shape, but it would then come to light that Port had a past that no one knew about. He lied about his past on dating websites and apps, claiming to have served in the Navy, that he attended Oxford University, and that he was a special needs teacher. On the 17th of June, he met up with 23-year-old Anthony Walgate and invited him to his apartment. There, he used medication to render him unconscious and ended Walgate's life. He called anonymously for an ambulance that would then get Walgate, but he couldn't be saved. 22-year-old Gabriel Kovari had lived with Port for a while, and he was his next victim. His life was ended in the same manner, and over the course of the next year, Port ended the lives of two more men, 21-year-old Daniel Whitworth and 25-year-old Jack Taylor. Kovari and Whitworth were found in the Church of St. Margaret of Antioch Cemetery, and Taylor was found in a field adjacent to it. It was eventually determined that Port was responsible, and he was arrested in 2015. He was charged with 4 counts of murder and 10 counts of administering poison, amongst other equally disturbing charges. He pleaded not guilty, but was eventually convicted of all the charges against him. He was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order that was issued, which means he'll never be considered for parole and will remain in prison until he passes away. He's currently incarcerated at the HM Prison Belmarsh in London. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.